Today we are going to work on both sections 2.2 and 2.3. Going to just combine them. Our objective is to add real numbers on a number line and using the rules of addition. On the warm-ups, number 1, those bars mean that we are taking the absolute value of -7. Carl, what is it? 7. Absolute value is distance from 0, so -7 is 7 units away from 0. Number 2, we have to take the absolute value of 7, which we just talked about, that's still 7, and add it to the absolute value of 3. Jariel, what is the absolute value of 3?
30.
Wonderful. We add those together, we should get 10. On number 3, we need to start inside the parentheses and evaluate the absolute values inside first. So we're just going to leave that minus negative sign outside for now. We were just told the absolute value of 3 is 3. We have to add that to the absolute value of -4. Ellie, what's the absolute value of -4? 4. Wonderful. We add those together. We get 7. You can leave your answer like this, or you can drop the parentheses. Okay, we would read this as -7 or the opposite of 7, which is just -7. Alright, number 4 is similar to number 3. We're going to leave that minus negative sign outside the parentheses. Kelby, what's the absolute value of 4? Wonderful. Minus. Lexi, what's the absolute value of 1?
1.
Wonderful. We still subtract those. Just because we've got absolute value bars around those numbers does not mean that this sign is going to change. So we leave it as subtraction. We get the opposite of 3, or -3. You can use a number line to demonstrate finding the sum of two real numbers. Moves to the left represent negative numbers. Moves to the right represent positive numbers. Alright, I know many of you are going to be able to do this without using a number line, but the number line helps us visualize what's going on. Okay, so on number 1, it tells us we're going to start at 8 and add -2. So I'm just going to put a little mark here at 8. And it said adding negatives would represent moves to the left. So I would move to the left 2 spaces and I land on 6. So 8 plus -2 would give me 6. On number 2, I'm starting at -3. So I'll put a little marker at -3. And then I'm adding +3. Which means that I'm moving to the right. So moving to the right 3. Okay, that means I landed at 0. So this is how we can use a number line to add positive and negative numbers. For every real number A, there is a unique real number, the opposite of A, such that A plus the opposite of A, or -A, equals 0. For our addition rules, if the numbers have the same sign, we are going to add the absolute values and keep the sign. If the numbers have opposite signs, that's when the rule gets a little weirder. We're going to subtract the absolute values. And keep the sign of the number with the larger absolute value. Example 1. Jalen, when we take positive 5 plus positive 6, what do we get?
11.
Positive 11. We add the absolute values, we keep the sign. Okay. On number 2, we have different signs, so we are going to subtract their absolute values. So what that looks like is the absolute value of negative 8 minus the absolute value of 4. So we subtract the absolute values and we'll keep the sign of the number with the larger absolute value. Okay. Jakeem, what's the absolute value of negative 8? And what's the absolute value of 4? Okay. So for this problem, we have to take 8 minus 4, which gives us 4. And then we keep the sign of the number with the bigger absolute value. So which of these two numbers has the bigger absolute value, Keon?
8.
The negative 8. So that means our answer is going to come out being negative. So it's a little weird that in order to do an addition problem, we had to use subtraction. But just think about this as like our scratch work off to the side. And this is how we get our actual answer. On number 3, we go back to having numbers with the same sign. They're both negative. So we're going to add up their absolute values and use the original sign. So since they're both negative, I already know my answer has to be negative. In order to get there, I'm going to have to add the absolute value of negative 11 with the absolute value of negative 5. Connie, what's the absolute value of negative 11? 11. And what's the absolute value of negative 5? 5. Wonderful. When I add those together, I get 16. So I know for my answer, it's going to be a negative 16. Add the absolute values, keep the original sign. All right, on number 4, we have different signs. We have a positive 13 plus a negative 6. So we are going to subtract their absolute values and use the sign of the number with the greater absolute value. So if you need to make yourself a little note, you can do it above. We're going to take the absolute value of 13 minus the absolute value of negative 6. Okay, what's the absolute value of 13, Jamal? 13. What's the absolute value of negative 6? Wonderful. 13 minus 6 gives us 7. And then we have to decide which number had the greater absolute value. Well, that would be 13. Right? 13 is bigger than 6. 13 was positive, so our answer is positive. We're finished. Number 5. We've got -9 plus -8. We have the same sign and we're adding them. So we add the absolute values. And we are going to keep the sign that we started with. So from the very beginning, I know my answer is going to be negative. Kion, what's the absolute value of -9? 9 plus, what's the absolute value of -8?
8.
Wonderful. We add them together to get 17. And we know our answer was negative because we started with the same sign. Add the same sign, you keep that sign. Finally, on number 6, we are adding with different signs, so we are going to subtract the absolute values and keep the sign of the number with the bigger absolute value. So, Tariana, what's the absolute value of -9?
9.
And the absolute value of 1? Wonderful. We subtract them, we get 8. Which number had the bigger absolute value? The 9. The 9 started out negative, so my answer is negative. Alright, looking at number 7. I notice that in the middle here, I have a -10 plus 10. Since this is all addition the whole way through, all addition, I can work from left to right, but addition is commutative. So addition, I can do in any order. I can switch it up. Only because every single sign is addition. Don't get this confused and think you can do this all the time. But since it's all addition, I can pull out these middle piece here, say -10 plus 10, adding opposites, that means that's going to go to 0. So those cancel each other out completely, leaving me with -11 plus 9. Okay. If you did not pull that out, if you didn't see that, didn't recognize it, it's not a big deal. It's just a time saver. When I take -11 plus 9, they have different signs, so I take the absolute values and subtract them. Okay, yes, you should still get the same answer even if you just straight worked left to right. Same thing. The absolute value of -11 is 11, minus the absolute value of 9 is 9. Okay, I subtract those and I get 2, but I use the sign of the number with the bigger absolute value, which would be -11. So I know my final answer is -2. You could have gotten there working just from left to right. You could have done it in any order really because it's all addition. So as long as you got to the same answer, how you did it is probably just fine. Alright, on to number 8. Again, it's all addition the whole way through, so I can add in any order I want to. Personally, I want to add numbers that have the same sign together first on this one. Nothing cancels out easily, so I'm going to add the +14 and the +7, because I know that gives me a +21. And I'm going to add the -10 and the -2, because I know that gives me a -12. So you can just add and keep the sign of the numbers. Okay, again, if you did it differently, if you worked left to right, you're going to end up with the same thing in the end. On this one, we have different signs now, so we're going to subtract and keep the sign of the number further from 0. Okay, the absolute value of 21 is 21. The absolute value of -12 is +12. I subtract those. 21 minus 12 gives me 9. 21 had the bigger absolute value and it was positive, so my answer is positive 9. So on number 9, within our first set of brackets, we have negative 7 plus 3. They have different signs, so I need to take the absolute values and subtract them. Okay, either way you work it out, whether you can do this in your head or you subtract their absolute values. Natalie, what did you get for negative 7 plus 3? Okay, so when we took negative 7 plus 3, we ended up with a negative 4. Now we need to move on to the other set of brackets. These brackets are easier because they have the same sign that we're adding together. A negative plus another negative. So we add their absolute values and keep that sign. So I already know that this is going to be a negative number here. In order to figure out what number it is, I'm adding the absolute values of those two numbers. The absolute value of negative 4 is 4. The absolute value of negative 2 is 2. So when I do that, I'm getting a 6. But again, it's really negative because I was adding two negatives together to get it. Now for this last part, I'm just taking negative 4 plus negative 6. Again, they have the same sign, so we are going to add the absolute values and keep that sign. So again, I can make my scratch work over here. The absolute value of negative 4 plus the absolute value of negative 6 is really 4 plus 6, so I know it's 10. But my sign was negative the whole time, so it's staying negative. Okay, on number 10, since I don't have any brackets or parentheses around sets of operations telling me to do certain things first, I know addition's commutative, so I can do this in whatever order I want. So again, I'm going to choose to add all of the positive numbers together first. When I do that, 10 plus 12 plus 14, I would get 36. And to that, I know I'm going to be adding some negative number because my other numbers here that I'm adding together are negative. So a negative 11 plus negative 13 is a negative 24. If you can group them to be adding with the same sign first, that makes it easier. Adding with the same sign, you add the absolute values, you keep that sign. The hard part is when they have different signs. So that we just want to do that once. Here, we are going to take the absolute value of 36, subtract the absolute value of negative 24. The absolute value of 36 is 36. The absolute value of negative 24 is positive 24. We are subtracting those. That gives us a 12. So I come over here and I know 12 is part of my answer, but then I have to decide which of these numbers had the bigger absolute value. The 36 has the bigger absolute value. It was positive, so our answer is positive. All right, a football team has the ball on its 20-yard line. Where is the ball after the next two plays? So, on part A, Logan, if I'm gaining 3 yards, do you think I should put a +3 or a -3? Plus. Gaining 5 yards, what do you think? Plus. Okay. So I'm going to add 3 and add 5. I started at the 20. I add 3. I add 5. They're all positive. So I know I'm just adding them all together, all their absolute values, and keeping it positive. So that's going to put me at the 28-yard line. On part B, Deja, if we've got a loss of 1 yard, how do you think we would represent that? If we have a loss of 1 yard, how would we represent that? Would we be adding or subtracting it? Subtracting. So a loss of 1 yard is going to be -1. What about a gain of 10 yards? Plus 10. So I'm adding these to where I started. So I'm going to have 20 plus a -1 plus a positive 10. Now once again, I like to do all my positives with the same sign first. So I'm going to take those outer parts first to give me 30 and then add on the -1. And what do we end up with? 29. So we're at the 29-yard line. So our first step, we substitute. In for x, I put a -3 plus. In for y, I put a positive 6. And we're still adding that -1 on the end. I like to group things together that have the same sign. So I'm going to group the -3 plus -1 first. We add the absolute values and we keep the sign. The absolute values would be 3 and 1. I add them together to get 4, but I keep the negative sign that they started out with. And then the plus 6 comes on down. This one is a little bit different from the ones we've seen before because the other ones were set up nicely for us. When we subtract the absolute values, we need to make sure we put the number with the bigger absolute value first. So I'm actually going to put the 6 first and then the -4 when I take the absolute values. The absolute value of 6 is 6. The absolute value of -4 is 4. We end up with a 2. Again, I put this 6 first because it had the bigger absolute value. So the 6 was positive. My answer is positive. On number 13, again, I start off by substituting in. So for the x, I put a -3. For the z, I put a -4. Now they all have the same sign. They're all negative. So I'm adding all their absolute values and keeping it negative. So if you want to do it one step at a time, you can. If we combine the first two, that's going to give me -24. We're still adding -4. They still have the same sign. We still add their absolute values and keep it negative to get a -28. Questions before our last problem? Okay. During a 4-day period at the Hotel Gran Via, the number of guests checking in and out were 32 in, 27 out, 28 in, 31 out, 12 in, 18 out, 16 in, 25 out. We want to know how to compare the number on the first day to the 4th day. If we are getting guests coming in, do we think that's positive or negative? Positive. And if they're going out, okay, so let's add up all the ones that are the same. So in we had 32, 28, 12, and 16. And we are adding all of these together. Going out, so we've got negative 27 plus a negative 31 plus negative 18 plus negative 25. So I'm going to spoil it for you and tell you that if we add up all the people coming in, that would give us 88. If we add up all the people going out, that was a negative 101. We are going to add those together. We take the absolute value, we subtract their absolute values because they have different signs. 101 is the bigger absolute value. We end up with negative 13. So there were 13 fewer people on day 4.